I let my ex-wife's new husband adopt my kids, then revealed he was a convicted felon. The divorce papers felt like sandpaper between my fingers when I signed them 3 years ago, but nothing prepared me for the phone call that would change everything. My ex-wife was practically bubbling with excitement as she told me about her new husband wanting to adopt our two kids, and how it would be so much better for everyone involved since they'd all have the same last name. I remember sitting in my cramped apartment, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on my kitchen table, feeling like the worst father in the world. The child support payments were crushing me, and I'd been struggling to make ends meet ever since the divorce. My Saturday visits with the kids had become increasingly awkward, with them asking why Daddy lived in such a small place and why we always had to eat at fast food restaurants. The guilt was eating me alive, especially when my 7-year-old daughter asked me why I couldn't just come home and live with them again. I'd fumble for words, trying to explain something that even I didn't fully understand anymore. The marriage had fallen apart so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when we stopped being a family and started being strangers sharing a house. When my ex-wife first introduced me to her new boyfriend, I have to admit I was impressed. He drove a brand new pickup truck, wore expensive clothes, and had this confident way of talking that made you believe everything he said. My kids seemed to like him immediately, which stung more than I care to admit. He'd bring them gifts every time he visited, take them to amusement parks, and even helped my son with his homework in ways I never had the patience for. The adoption conversation started casually enough, with my ex-wife mentioning how the new guy was already acting like a real father to the kids. She painted this picture of stability and happiness that I couldn't provide, and honestly, it made sense. I was barely keeping my head above water financially, working 2 jobs just to cover my basic expenses and still falling short on the support payments. I spent weeks agonizing over the decision, lying awake at night wondering if I was being selfish by holding onto my parental rights when clearly this other man could provide so much more. The kids were thriving in their new environment, living in a beautiful house with a big backyard, going to a better school district, and having all the things I wished I could give them but simply couldn't afford. The legal paperwork was more complicated than I expected, with multiple meetings and court appearances that made the whole thing feel surreal. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office, listening to him explain how the adoption would terminate my parental rights permanently, and feeling like I was signing my own death warrant. But every time I hesitated, I'd think about my kids' happiness and convince myself I was doing the right thing. The final court date arrived faster than I anticipated, and I found myself standing in front of a judge who seemed genuinely surprised that I was voluntarily relinquishing my rights. He asked me several times if I was certain about my decision, and each time I nodded, feeling pieces of my heart break off and fall into my stomach. My ex-wife and her new husband looked so happy, so perfect together, that I almost convinced myself this was meant to be. Walking out of that courthouse felt like leaving a funeral, except I was mourning my own life while everyone else celebrated. The kids hugged me goodbye with the same casual affection they'd show any family friend, not realizing they'd just legally become someone else's children. I drove straight home and spent the next 3 days in bed, calling in sick to both jobs and ignoring the world completely. The first few months after the adoption were the darkest period of my life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say I considered some pretty drastic solutions to make the pain stop. I'd drive by their house sometimes, just to catch a glimpse of the kids playing in the yard, feeling like a stranger watching someone else's family. The financial pressure actually eased up since I no longer had support obligations, but the emotional weight was crushing. I started drinking more than I should have, spending my evenings at dive bars trying to numb the constant ache in my chest. One night, I was drowning my sorrows with a guy I'd met at the bar, and he started telling me about his own custody battles and how his ex-wife's new husband turned out to be a real piece of work. That conversation stuck with me, planting a seed of doubt that I couldn't shake. Something about the way my ex-wife's new husband had swooped in so quickly and confidently started bothering me more and more. I began remembering little things that seemed off, like how he'd always paid for everything in cash and how he'd get really uncomfortable whenever conversations turned to his past. He'd mentioned growing up in different states, but was always vague about specific details or timelines. The paranoia started small, just random thoughts that would pop into my head while I was working or trying to sleep. I'd wonder about his background, about why someone so successful and put together would be interested in a divorced woman with 2 kids. Not that my ex-wife wasn't wonderful, but in my experience, guys like that usually had plenty of options and didn't typically sign up for instant fatherhood. I tried to convince myself I was just being bitter and jealous, that I was looking for reasons to feel better about losing my kids. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, especially when I'd see him at school events or soccer games, always seeming slightly on edge when other parents tried to make conversation. He had this way of deflecting personal questions that was so smooth you almost didn't notice. He wasn't actually answering anything. The turning point came when I ran into an old friend who worked in law enforcement, and we got to talking about my situation over beers. I mentioned my concerns about the new husband, expecting him to tell me I was being paranoid, but instead he got this serious look on his face. He suggested I might want to do some digging, just to put my mind at ease, and offered to help me run a background check. I wrestled with the decision for weeks, knowing that if I went down this path there was no going back. Part of me was terrified of what I might find, while another part was desperate to discover something that would justify my lingering resentment. I finally decided that if this guy was going to be raising my children, I had a right to know who he really was. The background check results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember my hands shaking as I opened the envelope. The first few pages looked normal enough, with basic information about employment and addresses, but then I got to the criminal history section and felt my blood turn to ice. Multiple arrests, several convictions, and a pattern of behavior that made my stomach turn. The charges ranged from financial fraud to assault, with dates spanning back over 15 years. There were restraining orders, court-ordered anger management classes, and even a conviction for domestic violence from a previous relationship. The most recent arrest was only 2 years ago, right around the time he would have been starting to date my ex-wife. I read through the documents 3 times, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding anything, and with each reading my horror grew. This wasn't just a guy with a sketchy past who'd turned his life around. This was someone with a clear pattern of manipulating and hurting people. The domestic violence conviction was particularly disturbing, involving a previous girlfriend who'd ended up hospitalized. The financial fraud charges painted a picture of someone who specialized in gaining people's trust and then exploiting them for money. He'd been involved in multiple schemes, from identity theft to investment fraud, always targeting people who were vulnerable or going through difficult times. The pattern was so clear, it was almost like reading a playbook for predatory behavior. I spent the next 2 days in a state of complete shock, trying to process what this meant for my kids' safety. Every interaction I'd witnessed between him and my children took on a sinister new meaning, and I kept replaying conversations looking for signs I'd missed. The expensive gifts, the quick courtship, the eagerness to adopt, it all suddenly made perfect sense in the most horrifying way possible. The question of what to do with this information consumed every waking moment. I couldn't just call my ex-wife and dump this on her, especially since legally I no longer had any standing as the kid's father. But I also couldn't sit by and do nothing when my children might be in danger. I was caught between my desire to protect them and my fear of being seen as a bitter ex-husband trying to cause trouble. I decided to approach the situation strategically, starting with my lawyer to understand what options I had given the recent adoption. The news wasn't encouraging. He explained that since the adoption was final, I had no legal rights regarding the children anymore. However, he suggested that if I had evidence of fraud in the adoption process, there might be grounds to challenge it. The fraud angle was complicated, but it centered around the idea that if the new husband had lied about his criminal history during the adoption proceedings, it could potentially invalidate the entire process. I requested copies of all the court documents and adoption paperwork, looking for any sworn statements or background check requirements that he might have falsified. Sure enough, there were multiple places where he'd sworn under oath that he had no criminal history, and the adoption had been approved based partly on his representation that he was an upstanding citizen with no legal issues. The evidence was clear and documented, but pursuing it would mean turning my family's life upside down and potentially putting my ex-wife through a devastating betrayal. I agonized over the decision for another week, going back and forth between wanting to protect my children and not wanting to destroy my ex-wife's happiness. She seemed genuinely happy for the first time since our divorce, and I knew that revealing this information would shatter her world completely. But every time I thought about walking away, I'd remember those domestic violence charges, and know I couldn't live with myself if something happened to my kids. The confrontation with my ex-wife was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had in my life. I asked her to meet me at a coffee shop, somewhere public where she'd feel safe but private enough for us to talk openly. I brought copies of all the documents and laid them out on the table between us, watching her face transform from confusion to disbelief to absolute horror. She went through the same process I had, reading and rereading the documents, asking if I was sure they were accurate, desperately hoping there was some mistake. I watched her realize that the man she'd married, the man she'd trusted with her children, was someone she'd never really known at all. The betrayal was written all over her face, and I felt terrible for being the one to destroy her happiness. The legal battle that followed was ugly and complicated, involving multiple lawyers, court hearings, and investigations. The adoption was ultimately reversed based on the fraudulent statements, and criminal charges were filed against the new husband for perjury and fraud. The whole process took nearly 6 months, during which time my ex-wife and I had to work together to protect our children from the media attention and legal complications. The most difficult part was explaining to the kids why their new dad had to go away, and why they were suddenly spending time with me again. We tried to keep the explanations age-appropriate, but children are perceptive and they knew something serious had happened. My daughter, who had grown particularly close to the new husband, was devastated and confused about why everyone was suddenly treating him like a bad person. Throughout this ordeal, I discovered things about my ex-wife that I'd never known during our marriage. She showed incredible strength and resilience in dealing with the betrayal, and she handled the legal proceedings with a grace that impressed even the lawyers. We started communicating more openly than we had in years, united by our shared concern for the children's well-being. The criminal trial revealed even more disturbing details about the new husband's past, including testimony from previous victims who described his pattern of targeting divorced women with children. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating predator who'd been planning to use his position as stepfather to gain access to our family's finances and potentially abuse his authority over the children. During the trial, I learned that he'd been investigated by Child Protective Services in his previous relationship, though no charges were filed due to lack of evidence. The thought of what might have happened to my children if I hadn't discovered his background still gives me nightmares. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison, and a restraining order was issued protecting our entire family. The aftermath of the trial was emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, but it also brought unexpected healing to my relationship with my ex-wife and kids. We started doing family activities together again, not as a romantic couple, but as co-parents who'd been through something traumatic together. The kids seemed to adjust better than expected, though they both required counseling to process the betrayal and confusion. My ex-wife and I never got back together romantically, but we developed a much healthier co-parenting relationship than we'd had even during our marriage. We established new custody arrangements that gave me regular time with the kids, and she was much more supportive of my role as their father. The near loss of my children had taught us both valuable lessons about what really mattered. The financial situation improved dramatically once the legal fees were settled and normal custody arrangements resumed. I was able to move into a bigger apartment and start saving money for the kids' future expenses. More importantly, I felt like I had purpose again, like I was actually contributing to my children's lives instead of just being a weekend visitor. The experience taught me that sometimes the most difficult decisions are the right ones, even when they seem to hurt everyone involved in the short term. If I had let my guilt and self-doubt prevent me from investigating the new husband's background, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The temporary pain of disrupting their lives was nothing compared to the potential long-term damage he could have caused. Looking back now, I realized that losing my kids through adoption was actually what saved them from a much worse fate. The process forced me to examine my own priorities and fight for what was truly important, rather than just accepting what seemed easiest or most convenient. It also showed me that being a good father isn't just about providing financial support or maintaining a perfect household. The relationship with my children today is stronger than it's ever been, built on a foundation of trust and shared experience that we never had before. They understand that I fought for them when it mattered most, and that knowledge has created a bond that goes beyond typical parent-child relationships. We talk more openly about difficult topics, and they know they can count on me to be honest with them even when the truth is hard to hear. My ex-wife eventually started dating again, but she's much more cautious now about introducing men to the children. She does thorough background checks and takes time to really get to know someone before allowing them into our family's life. The experience taught her to trust her instincts and not be swept away by charm and expensive gifts. The kids have also learned valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and trusting their instincts when something feels wrong. We've had age-appropriate conversations about how some people aren't who they pretend to be, and how it's important to tell trusted adults when something makes them uncomfortable. These are hard lessons for children to learn, but they're essential for their safety. The whole experience changed my perspective on what it means to be a parent and what constitutes a successful family. I learned that love isn't always about making people happy in the moment. Sometimes it's about making difficult decisions that protect them in the long run. The temporary pain of disappointing my children was worth it to keep them safe from someone who could have caused lasting harm. I still struggle with guilt about the time I lost with my kids and the trauma they experienced because of my initial decision to allow the adoption. But I've come to understand that dwelling on those regrets doesn't help anyone, and that the most important thing is how we move forward from here. The experience has made all of us stronger and more aware of the importance of family bonds. Today, 3 years after the whole ordeal ended, we've settled into a new normal that works for everyone. I have regular custody time with the kids, my ex-wife and I communicate effectively about parenting decisions, and the children have adjusted well to their new reality. We've all learned to be more careful about who we trust, but we haven't let the experience make us cynical or closed off to new relationships. The story has become something of a cautionary tale in our community, shared quietly among divorced parents as a reminder to be vigilant about new partners and to trust their instincts when something doesn't feel right. Several people have told me they've done background checks on their own partners after hearing about our experience, and at least one discovered information that changed their relationship decisions. I've also become something of an advocate for other parents going through similar situations, offering support and advice to those dealing with custody issues or concerns about their ex-partner's new relationships. The experience gave me insights into the legal system and investigative processes that I never expected to need, but that have proven valuable in helping others navigate similar challenges. The most important lesson I learned is that being a parent means being willing to make unpopular decisions and face difficult truths when your children's safety is at stake. It means looking beyond surface appearances and trusting your instincts even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. And sometimes, it means accepting that love requires sacrifice, and that protecting your children might mean disappointing them in the short term. The whole experience has made me a better father, a more careful person, and someone who understands the importance of fighting for what matters most. I nearly lost my children forever because I was too focused on my own guilt and financial struggles to see the bigger picture. But in the end, that near loss became the catalyst for building a stronger, more honest relationship with them than I ever thought possible. Looking at my kids now, healthy and happy and safe, I know that every difficult moment of that experience was worth it. They're growing up with a clearer understanding of right and wrong, a stronger sense of their own worth, and the knowledge that their father will always fight for them no matter what the cost. And that's a legacy I can be proud of, even if the path to get here was more complicated than I ever imagined it would be.